Hey, this is Terakai, and this is the first video that I have done as just myself since the very first video on this channel, the intro video. And in that video, I talked about how I'd like to discuss anxiety and depression, which are two things that I have dealt with. One of the biggest pieces of advice I can give is the importance of staying positive, but it's also an awfully frustrating piece of advice. First off, it's obvious. Obviously, being positive is a good thing, but at the same time, obviously, if being positive was easy, then you probably wouldn't have to be told it in the first place. It's not particularly helpful to hear. If you're dealing with clinical depression, or if you're dealing with crippling anxiety and someone says, well, you got to be positive, your response might be, well, okay, yes, but how? And sometimes, why should I be positive in the face of this? Because that's another issue, is when you're in a state of severe depression or severe anxiety, it seems very reasonable that there isn't rationale behind positivity, simply because, things are so shitty. Oftentimes, when you're depressed or when you have anxiety, it feels like a forever thing. It feels like you're entrapped. And it's a very frustrating thing, because there's nothing that I've encountered that's worse than the feeling that you are trapped in your own head. If you're in a bad situation, you can potentially leave that bad situation, but if the bad situation is in your head, how do you leave that? And that kind of ties into something in the realm of positivity that I think is a good starting point, and it's still advice that's easier to say than to take, but I think it's a good thing to think of for yourself, is to allow for the possibility that things are going to get better. When I was dealing with the worst of my depression, I was a teenager, and I had experienced depression basically throughout my entire teenage life. And the way my depression went is it got worse as my teenage years went on, to the point where I actually missed a year of high school. So it had reached a point where I had a very easy time rationalizing the idea that my life was basically over, because the only thing when you're at that age that you've ever had to measure yourself by in terms of success is how are you doing in school, and maybe do you have a part-time job. I was no longer going to school. I had left school before high school had finished, so I couldn't very well say that I was succeeding at school. And I had never had a part-time job. I had never had a job where I had been paid money. So it seemed very reasonable for me at the age of 16 or 17 to think, not only am I feeling crappy now, but my life is never going to get better. I have already ruined my life. And it seems like a never-ending spiral. And it wasn't. That's the big takeaway from it. It wasn't. I eventually did finish high school. I eventually did get paying work. Things eventually did start looking up for me, to the point where it didn't happen all at once. There isn't a moment I could point to and say, this is when I stopped dealing with depression. It was something more in retrospect that I could look back on and say, yeah, I was depressed back then, but I'm not depressed anymore. And I don't know when I stopped being depressed, because it's not a binary thing. You're not necessarily either depressed or not depressed. It's more like shades. So I couldn't point to this is what cured me, as it were. And I can't even necessarily say that I'm cured. A common question I'll see in like a forum is, for people that were depressed and are not depressed anymore, how did you fix it? What was the secret towards doing that? And there isn't like a single solution. It's, first off, it's situational, and secondly, it's a progressive thing. It's something that gets better over time. But I think one thing to consider when you are in the worst of the depression is just the idea that even though it feels like there's no end, there can be an end. And it's okay if you don't know how to get to that end, because you don't even necessarily need to know how to get to that end. It's something that can get better over time, fairly organically. What I mean is, it's okay if you don't have the answers. Just as long as, at least for a starting point, you say to yourself, maybe things will get better. You don't even necessarily have to say to yourself, things will get better. Maybe you're not necessarily ready for that. But maybe just, there's that chance that things will get better. I have no idea how. It doesn't seem possible. But in the grand scheme of things, weirder things have happened to people than me recovering from this. So maybe it's going to happen. And I think that's a nice starting point. And I think if I had the ability to talk to myself back in the thick of it, back when I wasn't going to high school anymore, back when I was literally sleeping till, I guess, about 7, 8 p.m. in the day, and if I had a chance to go back and talk to that person, that's the thing I would tell them. Things can get better. I have no idea how they'll get better, but things can get better. Maybe that would have lifted a bit of weight off my shoulders, the sense of dread and hopelessness that I had at the time, if I had allowed for the possibility that things could get better. That was something I considered a lot when I was in the worst stages of the anxiety, because the anxiety came the worst of the anxiety came like a decade after I had dealt with depression. So I had kind of my experience with depression to fall back on, but anxiety was also a very new hurdle for me. So, it was, even though I had these tips that I would have given myself during my depression, it still was hard to stay upbeat with the anxiety. During the worst of my anxiety, I would have at least one bad anxiety attack every day. And that's discouraging, because during the day you're kind of building that up in your head. Like, when is it going to happen? Can I prevent it? Will this be the day that breaks the trap? Kind of thinking. And of course that doesn't help, because I think overthinking can contribute to anxiety, but still that idea that things might get better, and I don't have the solution as to how it's going to get better. I was actively looking for solutions, and some things would click and some things didn't help at all, and that was really frustrating. One common thing that I heard that could help with anxiety was meditation, and I felt, in my personal experience, and I say this with a bit of hesitation because I worry that by saying it, some people might get it in their head that this is going to be true for them, when it very well might not be. One thing that triggered anxiety for me was attempts to meditate. And meditation is supposed to be relaxing. So the idea that meditation can be counterproductive to me dealing with anxiety was a very frustrating idea. But at the end of the day, it still worked out. And I guess I'll talk about how I tackled the anxiety in a later video, because it's a more recent thing, so I can kind of pinpoint specific events that helped me there more easily. But for this video, I mostly just wanted to talk about my single biggest piece of advice. Whether or not it's helpful, I don't know, but just allow for the possibility that things can get better. And also, kind of tying into that, be okay with small victories. Be okay with small changes. You know, when you're depressed or when you're dealing with anxiety, it is horrible. And you want things better. And you want them better now. And that's, you know, reasonable, and frankly, you deserve things to be better now. Even if you don't necessarily feel like you deserve it, you really do. And I can say that with confidence, even having no idea who you are or anything about you, that you deserve better, because everyone deserves better. You know, you might hear that and think, well, yeah, but, you know, you don't really know me. You don't know the things that I think about myself, that I think negatively about myself, but you do deserve better. Just because everyone deserves better. Even if you don't feel deserving, you do, simply by existing, deserve better. You'll potentially be even frustrated by small victories because you feel it's not good enough. And that's not unreasonable, but at the same time, sometimes the small victories will eventually lead to bigger victories. So even though you deserve more than a small victory, you gotta be happy with the small victories too. You know, don't settle for it, but don't dismiss the smaller victories, because you're potentially missing out on the cumulative effect that those smaller victories will provide. Just having that, allowing for the possibility that things are going to get better, I feel is a pretty good thing to include in your arsenal. And if you already have that, then that's awesome. Then this video wasn't necessarily helpful for you. Maybe videos in the future will be. I guess the one other thing I want to say before I close out is, the longer it goes on, the more discouraging it can get. There's no timetable that you have to be better by. That's might seem discouraging in and of itself, but what I mean is, if someone else got better quicker, that doesn't say anything less about you. And in addition, this isn't necessarily something that you'll ever feel comfortable saying you're cured of. Like, I haven't taken medication related to depression since I was maybe 20. At the same time, I would be hesitant to say that I'm cured of depression, because I don't really think it works that way. You know, it's not really a thing that you're necessarily cured of. So I don't think that you should be discouraged by the idea that you are or you're not cured. I think it can be a bit more complicated than that. And I think I take some personal sense of accomplishment in how I've progressed, and in terms of the struggles that I've worked through. And I think, you know, it might be helpful if you look at things that way too, where you think, you know, this is a crappy situation, and I don't want it, but I also am a little proud of myself that I am fighting this fight, and I am enduring it, and I am, through enduring it, in some ways getting stronger. Even if I don't necessarily feel stronger right now, just through virtue of going through it, it is in some respects making me stronger. I kind of want to make more videos like this. If people find this useful in some regard, I'll have other videos that have nothing to do with this too in the future. More pending sketches. I'd like to do some Let's Plays as just myself, as Terakai. I've held back on doing that so far just because I've kind of had it in my head. It's like, well, are people really going to want me to do a Let's Play? But yeah, I won't know if people will or won't until I try it, right? So at some point I am going to put out a Let's Play video as well. So until then, have a great day. If you are going through things, I hope things get better for you. I hope you find ways to be optimistic, at least some of the time. You know, it's never 100% thing, but at least some of the time. So I hope you get more and more optimistic more and more often as time goes on. And I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.